Well, a few weeks ago here on the show, we brought you the story of the judge in Texas finally saying, you know what, Pfizer, you have to release these documents that were associated with the advertising campaign that you then employed across the nation to say that your drugs were safe. Now, initially, Pfizer and the FDA basically tried to keep those documents secret for 75 years. Like we weren't going to get access to those for many, many, many years, right? Well, judge said, no, we need to see these documents. So we released them. We got a chance to go through them. We showed a couple of pages of them here on the show. There were over 8 pages of adverse effects. Everything from herpes to myocarditis. Mm-hmm. The list was endless. These weren't just symptoms that they just made up. These were actual symptoms and adverse effects that came from people reporting back, going through the trial phases of all of this.
Well, it turns out there's a whistleblower now who is speaking out, who worked for a company that Pfizer contracted to manage the trial for the data for the trial, rather. This researcher says that the studies were supposed to be blind, and they weren't, that her company was actually writing like the name of the participant on the samples, so therefore unblinding her. They were not keeping good track of which patient was which. They were mislabeling things, miscoding things. She provided proof of this to the FDA because she actually brought this to her bosses, and her boss gave her the business about taking photos, and to which now the FDA followed up, but actually did nothing.
So and also there's a lot of people who, and I've seen their testimonies in Congress, where during the trial, they were given an app and they had to track their adverse reactions, but there was a drop-down menu that only let them select like 5 different things. If it fell outside of that, they could not report it, and in many cases were removed from the trial and told that it was something else.
That's how a lot of, unfortunately, FDA trials work nowadays, and it is allowed to, in some cases, if the drug maker is, powerful enough, you're allowed to drop out people who had adverse reaction, which you have to wonder then, how effective are these trials? Right. But this woman is making a strong point about methodology, right? If you're going to say something's blind, it has to be. If you're going to run a clean lab, and if the FDA is going to actually follow up on something, she was punished for doing this and fired hours later. Let's listen to her story.
I was working on Pfizer's phase 3 pivotal trial on their COVID-19 vaccine. My first day on the job was the 8th of September, and from the very beginning, I noticed irregularities, things that were questionable. I would bring up the concerns to my managers, and it was always, we're understaffed, we're really trying hard to, make this work. At one point when I was going through emails, there were emails from ICON begging Ventavia to follow up on severe adverse events that had been reported. There were several emails about mislabeled specimens, blood specimens, and the nasal swabs. There were specimens that were labeled with another participant's information. It was a nightmare.
A nightmare, so much so that when she went into the lab, one night, she says she was there by herself. She went into the lab area and she saw all of these samples as part of the trial that just sort of literally laying around, stuff laying in the trash, syringes laying in the trash. So she took a bunch of photos. She's like, this is highly, highly wrong. I mean, this literally should basically end the trial because it's so wrong.
And don't forget that she said that she was working on the phase 3 part of it, but what Trump was able to do to get it out so fast is they bypassed phase 3. So they didn't even go through the entire phase 3 to get it out to us. It was skipped.
That's a great point. So she says, she took all these photos and then she's like, this is wrong, right? She took it to her superiors and she recorded herself. So this is secret audio of her recording herself talking to her superiors, explaining about the photos. And this is what her bosses had to say about this and how she was fired as a result.
It was a nightmare.
You sent me the photos, thank you, and I didn't pull them up. I mean, now granted, that's whether I'm
I mean,
trusted or not. So I might have
should
to
I
go
not have
online
taken the
and-
pictures?
The problem is the breach of confidentiality, and it was on a personal phone because there's sponsor information on those boxes.
At that point, it was clear to me that I wasn't fitting in. I decided that next morning I was gonna report my company to the FDA. And so I did that about 9 o'clock in the morning on the 25th of September. And about 6 hours later, I got a call from Ventavia and was fired on the spot and told that I was not a good fit.
What does it take to be a good fit?
She's not trying to be a troublemaker here.
No, in fact, she tried to do the right thing before she was fired.
She did try to go to her boss, and you hear her boss saying, I didn't pull them up.
I didn't even want to look at the pictures. I didn't want to see the pictures that you sent.
But the problem is there's confidentiality. Well, how do you know if you didn't open them? And why are we not worried about actually fixing our study to be reliable and valid, right?
Well, and just forget the names. That part doesn't even bother me as much as like, okay, the unblinded piece of this. So we know that John Smith was one of the people. Okay, that's one piece of it. I get the privacy piece of it. But all of the adverse effects that were coming back in these trials were being covered up and misplaced and removed and deleted. Like that to me is the most egregious part.
Well,
of
you
this.
look at some of her. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and when she mentions the word, we got to worry about the sponsor. Now, the sponsor generally is a financial backer, right? Or does that necessarily mean
I wasn't clear
that?
on that. I'm not sure
Not exactly sure.
what that means.
Yeah, the word sponsors threw me off too, because it's like, what are you talking about? Like, is like Coca-Cola sponsoring? Like, what are you talking about?
Well, I mean, look,
it's on the box.
This Ventavia lab was part of Pfizer. I mean, Pfizer was using this lab as part of its trial. I mean, this is part of Pfizer, basically. It's an extension of Pfizer. So when she makes them aware of it at the FDA, and then the FDA does nothing about it, whitewashes it, hides it, we don't know about it. We don't know about the adverse effects of this. I mean, everything from myocarditis, as we talked about in these documents, 8 pages of adverse symptoms.
Well, she does go on to say that the FDA called her, and I think she says we spoke for an hour and 14 minutes or something very specific. She was documenting everything so that, I mean, I do think it seems like she has a wrongful termination suit, and maybe that's what she's aiming at. But she also wants this to be out there because Pfizer continued to use her company as a contractor to run the trials, right?
Right. But anyway, she was fired and now is able to come forward about it. So good to her. I mean, these are people that need protecting, who are trying to do the right thing. I mean, good for her. She brought this to her manager's awareness. They ignored her. Then when they ignored her and they didn't do anything about it, didn't scrap the data because it was wrong, then she goes to the FDA, and then 6 hours later, she's fired for doing the right thing.
Well, and we've seen how the United States treats whistleblowers. You know, it's like, first of all, the government goes after them, but then through the public opinion, court of public opinion, because they do all this media thing and like dig up things on their past and degrade them or whatever. These people put their lives out there and risk a lot to get us this information, more than people realize.
Sure.
So how do things change? You know, Wrestler X keeps saying, I don't like hearing about this stuff because then I don't know how to change it. It's like, well, I mean, you can go through your life like blinded to this stuff. But, you know, even as like Kid Rock was asked about this on the Tucker show the other night, he asked him about, what do you think about Fauci now? And he said, look, he said, F Fauci. He said, in the beginning, I believed everything he had to say. He said, I was wiping down my doorknobs. I was doing everything but they lied to us. They lied to us. And so what happens is now going forward, we are going to be less inclined to listen to them. You know, and that's what we can do to maybe protect ourselves in the future. When these big companies, when these corporations that make billions of dollars, am I keeping you?
No.
Are like, you know, making a comment about what we should do with our lives, then we should absolutely question everything that they have to do. You know, have to tell us.
You don't have to
the thing is, like,
passive
if we can-
aggressively.
I know
Sometimes,
George W. Bush.
You know,
George H.W. Bush in a
You guys know how sometimes my watch just like responds to us while we're talking here on the show, and I felt a little vibration and I didn't want it to say again, I don't know what you're talking about. So I checked my watch and Clayton called me out. You know, recently we were on a vacation and I was sitting next to an English couple. Well, I had my 3 kids because Clayton was, I don't know where he, oh no, you went and put Eve to bed. And I had the older 2. And this British couple told us, I said, yeah, you know, great to travel again, right? Just sort of, we were making conversation. They said, yeah, well, thanks to the jab, we've had like 3 or 4. And they're telling me, you know, there's no adverse reaction to the vaccine. And I'm like, I'm just talking about being here at the hotel. I don't want to talk to you about this. Where do you get this from? Like, how do you know this? And they started in on telling me to vaccinate my kids. And I'm like, that's interesting. Because there is some data that does suggest some adverse reaction. And my children had COVID recently, so I'm going on that data. So, you know, where does this British couple out of nowhere start telling me what they know? I just was like, I wonder what your Facebook feed looks like.
Oh my God.
Well,
Yeah,
and
it's-
also you
it's
got to think too, as
conviction
we're getting
bias.
this information and as covering these stories and stuff, and you start to learn a little bit more about what's actually going on, then you start then their narrative starts to fall apart for everything. And so then eventually the narrative for a third party can't win in the United States, those narratives, the more that we learn, even though we feel like we can't do anything, at some point the narratives that keep us from getting these people out of power will start to fall apart. But we have to know, like, we have to continually tell people and teach people, because a lot of people are still watching mainstream media and they still believe all that stuff they're being told. So we're just kind of like one at a time getting people away from that narrative. And that's what it's going to take. And then at some point, hopefully, we'll be like, no, a third party actually can win and we can disrupt this stranglehold.
You know what, though? That's me. Like, from starting doing this show and doing more research on things rather than less, I've become one of those who originally was like, maybe would have changed my profile to, you know, a Ukraine flag, maybe would have said that all of these like gender discussion in school should be done. And I feel like the more I prepare for this show, the more I'm like, wow, who am I? You know, even like I didn't want anything to do with the Hunter Biden story. I thought that was just a smear campaign. But the more you read, the more you research, the more you're like, damn, you
have
know,
come a long way.
like the crazy people are right. The world is crazy.
I'm proud of you. I
But
will say
how
I'm
do
proud of
we-
you. You come along. And here's the thing with Natalie, I will say, because that is her, she would have been like, change, you know, she reads, she researches, and when you I think the worst kind of people are inflexible people, right?
Mm-hmm.
If things come along that change your mind because facts present themselves and now we see data because it was hidden from us, and like the worst kind of people are when they're presented with that information who stick to their narrative.
Yeah.
They
Well,
stick
that's
to
what-
their, you know.
I always
Well,
say,
you-
don't plant a flag. Don't like you. Everybody seems to want to plant a flag on the left and the right, and they're gonna,
Yeah.
you know, information be damned. I'm keeping my flag on the left because they're the ones that are right. They're the ones that are for the people. And so we
Yeah.
just have to not plant flags and be willing to, you know, take that flag and move it a little bit further to the other side. Because like I've said so many times, none of this is going to get fixed unless we can all come to the middle, because the middle is where the truth is.
William Yates says, weren't you a tech reporter? She was, but she started her life as a journalist for a newspaper in San Francisco. So then became in the technology.
Yes, I was on the business page.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even like if you rewind the tape, the first time David said ivermectin, I was like, no, ivermectin's for horses. Shut up. You know.
we give that
but
to
then when
Grover.
you look at the trials out of Japan, how am I supposed to say what the media tells me? Grover did just have ivermectin this
did.
week.
He did.
Yeah. What worries me the most about ivermectin is actually the antibiotic that they put into the soil after they've had it. So, you know, you should deworm your pets. And so we do it in the spring and the fall. And then when they actually, their stool gets into the ground, that antibiotic can harm the bugs and the fungi that the vegetation is dependent on. So if you do give your pets ivermectin, try and pick up their stool for a little while after.
If you like this content, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, we have a membership program. For the price of a cup of coffee once a month, you can support independent journalism just by going to morninginvest.com/join.
You get access to exclusive videos, plus the ability to join and chat with us live. We really appreciate your subscription, and you are supporting independent journalism.